Welcome back to the second session of our inaugural Multi-Stakeholder Forum for the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism for 2020. My name is Courtney Gregoire, and I have the honor of serving as Chief Digital Safety Officer at Microsoft and the Operating Board Chair for the GIFCT. Yesterday, I provided a few brief remarks, and I closed with the notion that together we are animated by the goal of seeking to prevent the exploitation of the internet by terrorists and violent extremists to advance human rights. To do this work, we must make sure we are thinking about how to do it transparently, guided by the desire to continually improve, learn, and continually collaborate. I want to take a brief moment and thank the tremendous speakers from our first session for bringing that work to life. Personally, I learned a lot and brought new insights into the work that we must do at the GIFCT. We have a robust agenda today, and we're really appreciative of those of you who have rejoined us for a second conversation. Let me pass the baton again to our Executive Director, Nick Rasmussen.
Well, thank you, Courtney, and good afternoon, good evening, and in some cases, good morning to you around the world. And for those of you who attended session one of the Multi-Stakeholder Forum earlier today, welcome back. And for those of you who were sleeping or otherwise engaged during that first session, it's great to welcome you to the newly independent GIFCT's inaugural event. But before we begin, just a few brief housekeeping notes. I want to remind everybody today that the event is being recorded, mostly because of the difficulty in holding a conference with participants spanning almost every time zone. Session one from earlier today, which lasted just a bit over 90 minutes, was recorded and is available to view on the event webpage. We also emailed a link to that session to all of our registered attendees, so you should have that. We've also tried to make this virtual forum event as inclusive and interactive as possible, of course, given the inherent limitations of the format. And to that end, we've included a live chat function on the event webpage, and we certainly hope that you'll engage with each other, with us, via that platform during the event. And lastly, as I'm sure you all know, we've also included a breakout room option at the end of this full plenary session today for those who want to engage in a more detailed way with one of our 6 GIFCT working groups. And at last count, we had more than 100 participants who will be taking advantage of that opportunity to join a breakout session. So we're grateful for that. I won't try to summarize or recap session one for those of you who are not able to join, but as Courtney indicated, the session allowed us to outline some of the new leadership structure of the newly independent GIFCT organization. And importantly, to introduce Bjorn Eiler, the chair of our independent advisory committee. And lastly, to hear a panel of experts discuss the current threat landscape, particularly as it bears on the work of GIFCT. Dr. Shiraz Maher and a panel of distinguished experts provided a very rich and substantive deep dive into the current state of terrorism and violent extremism in the online environment. And in my mind, that discussion very nicely set the frame for session two today, right now, which I believe will focus more practically on the effort to develop workable solutions to the challenges that we all recognize. And in my own remarks earlier today, I referred to the 6 working groups that we're hearing from in this session as the engine room where practical results can and must be found to the challenges that we all observe. Each of these 6 working groups is focused on particularly challenging topics or issues, as you will hear very shortly. And our aim has been to organize working groups that are both representative and inclusive of multiple perspectives, while still being modest enough in size that real dialogue and exchange, detailed exchange among working group members is possible. And as I noted also earlier today, I hope that when GIFCT convenes next year's multi-stakeholder forum, hopefully in person, we'll be able to look with satisfaction at the output of these working groups as measured in practical, workable steps to make the online environment safer and healthier. So with that, let's move to the presentations from the working groups, which will be followed by comments and interventions from 3 distinguished panelists. But in order to minimize handoffs between speakers, much as we did yesterday, I'll briefly introduce each speaker in the working group section here at the outset. First, we'll have Dina Hussain from Facebook, who will present on the Academic and Practical Research Working Group. Lucy Caldine from Google chairs the Content Algorithms, Processes, Practical Interventions Working Group, and she will present next. Lucy will be followed by Jacqueline Bocher from Microsoft, who will present on the Crisis Response Working Group. And after Jacqueline, Nick Pickles from Twitter will outline the legal working group's agenda and work plan. And lastly, the 5th and 6th working groups focused on transparency and technical approaches, respectively, will be presented by Dr. Aaron Saltman from Facebook. So with that, let me hand over to Dina to start the process of stepping through the working groups. Dina, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Thumbs up. Thank you. So first off, again, I'd like to thank and echo the many thanks that have come from Nick, as well as my other colleagues. Big thanks go to Microsoft for organizing and helping helm as chair of this year, but also I'm incredibly excited to welcome Nick and all of the GIFCT's newly formed team into the fold. We're very much looking forward to having you and working with you. So I would like to start off with talking you through the Academic and Practical Research Working Group. Since its founding in 2017, GIFCT has placed atop of its list of goals the prioritization of understanding the incoming threat landscape facing those of us working at the intersection of terrorism and technology. We understood then, as we do now, that effective countering of terrorism and violent extremism will unquestionably rely on leveraging expertise, the expertise of those who are working on understanding the nuance of the manifestation of this threat. In that spirit, as described in our earlier panels by my colleague Shiraz Maher, one of the main 4 pillars of GIFCT's work is our partnership with researchers across the globe to commission high-quality, nuanced research that leverages insight from tech companies and aims to constructively highlight gaps and opportunities in the policies and practices of countering terrorism online. In this same vein, we continue this work of partnering with our academic and practical research colleagues. So in that same vein, as I mentioned, we continue this partnership, and it's very much my honor to welcome our co-chairs, Dr. Brett Krubacek and Alexandre Corbet from Public Safety Canada, along with Dr. Shiraz Maher and Dr. Charlie Winter from the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, which you will have heard a little more about in part 1 of this forum. As I mentioned earlier, the aim of the GIFCT's research pillar and the aim of the working group has been to partner with experts in our field to better understand the various ways in which violent extremism as a threat manifests and intersects with tech platforms. To supplement and support this, the Academic and Practical Research Working Group aims to explore innovative multi-sector research collaborations and develop a baseline of best practices that include the conducting, the funding, the dissemination, and the support for research that is addressing this nexus of technology and violent extremism. So the Academic and Practical Research Working Group is going to aim to look at a wide variety of expertise and a wide variety of regional applications, but also it will be landscape mapping, highlighting the existing research on violent extremism trends, as well as identifying the thematic analysis gaps that currently exist and the structural barriers to this kind of research. We're also aiming to build up cross-sector collaboration, where we can identify areas for potential partnerships that will better inform, better coordinate, and enable more research to take place in general. In addition to that, we're hoping to build best practices around the insurance of the safety, the conduct of this research is both aiming at the safety of the researchers, the privacy of any of the users whose content is being studied, and the ethical standards that we all know are needed within this space and within research in general. In addition, we're hoping to really use this opportunity to scope funding opportunities that will enable us to find complementary funding sources and partner them up with the research that would be a good fit. So as I mentioned earlier on, this is one of the very first working groups that was launched. It's also, I'm very proud to say, one of the most popular of the working groups. The Academic and Practical Working Group adds to the sphere of partnerships that GIFCT already has. And we're taking on representatives from academia, from tech, from civil society, from government, and especially from policy. This working group is already helming an exceptional cross-sector collaboration that we're really hoping to build on. So our progress to date is that we have completed our first meeting, which went, I'm slightly biased, but I think it went spectacularly and included a huge regional diversity. We have agreed upon the initial working group parameters. So we've agreed upon scope, modes of cooperation. We all agreed that diversity and regional representation is going to be one of our main goals. In addition, we're hoping to prioritize collaboration and partnership between all of these different sectors. In addition, as I mentioned, we are one of the most popular working groups. All of the working groups are popular, but we've already been able to start with the exceptional amount of input and excitement around the working group. We've already started 2 subgroups that will look at thematic and methodological obstacles to research, but also structural focuses on how to conduct research, what the regional manifestations of this kind of threat is. So next on our list is that the working group will conduct a horizon scanning exercise that will include a top-line literature review of all of the very diverse academic voices that we have at the table, in addition to any exceptional work that we should be aware of and that policymakers and tech companies should be aware of. In addition, we're hoping to create written assessments for the research gaps that are present, and we're preparing for thematic virtual workshops, which we will then hope to develop policy briefs out of. Finally, on what other pertinent information you should know about this working group, we very much are collaborative. While I do keep saying that we are one of the most popular, I fully believe that all of the other working groups that we're working with bring exceptional insights, and we're really excited to coordinate closely with the content sharing algorithms, process and positive interventions working group that Lucy is heading, the technical approaches working group, the transparency working group, but also the crisis response working group and the legal parameters working group, because I think there is an exceptional overlap that we can work off of. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Lucy and look forward to hearing any of the feedback from any of the facilitators and the participants on the call. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dina. Hello. Thank you, Dina. Hello, everyone. I'm Lucy Calladine. I am Google's public policy lead for countering extremism. And really to echo some of the comments from Dina there, to say a huge thank you to Nick and team for, well, allowing me to speak, allowing all of us to report on the progress we've made, but also a huge thank you to Courtney, Jacqueline, Zoe and Crystal for their exceptional leadership at Microsoft and getting us to this point also. So I am one of the co-facilitators of the working group that is humbly named Content Sharing Algorithms, Processes and Positive Interventions. Now, please forgive me if I use CAPI as a shorthand to get me through. But I am not alone in co-leading this working group. I am very fortunate to be co-leading it with Chris Meserole from the Brookings Institute, as well as Manisha Bicker, who is a representative from the Government of New Zealand. Those of you who will be joining us after these presentations in the breakout sessions, I very much look forward to introducing you to Manisha and Chris. Next slide, please. So here you can hopefully all see the objective for the CAPI working group. And really it's to say there are 2 parts to this objective. Is it worth me just pausing? Do we have the right slides? Thank you, Dina. The objective slide, please. Thank you very much. So with the CAPI working group objective, it's worth just pausing for a moment and thinking about the genesis of this working group. The objective reflects that genesis, and you may notice that it largely falls into 2 parts. Firstly, to consider the automated content sharing processes that are used by industry that may recommend or amplify terrorist and violent extremist content, but also this second part around positive interventions. So when we're considering those processes, are there actually opportunities to suggest users may wish to engage with alternative sources of information? Next slide, please. So here you can see 4 of the strategies that we are currently considering as a working group to take us forward. And the first of these is about trust and collaboration. Now, Dina's working group, I think, is that her USP is quite how popular it is. And I would say that my working group is also an entirely new endeavour. And it's certainly an entirely new endeavour for government, tech, and for civil society to come together and consider these issues. So for us to be successful, it's going to be absolutely critical that we have an open environment where everybody feels that they can bring their expertise, be listened to, and contribute. The second one is define. So to agree amongst the working group members what we're actually talking about. We need to set a common understanding between us of what do we mean by content sharing algorithms, what do we mean by content sharing processes, and likewise positive interventions. So that's going to be something important as we consider the scope of the working group from the off. The third strategy is about mapping approaches. We're an incredibly fortunate working group, and we have a huge breadth of expertise as well as geographies represented in our membership. That means that our members come with incredible knowledge and understanding. So one of our strategies is going to be about mapping our understanding as a collective, and as part of that process also thinking about maybe some of the gaps in our knowledge that throws up. And lastly, develop. So for those of you who joined this morning's session, you'll have heard Nick, the Executive Director, talk about his ambitions for these working groups. And they're largely predicated on we need tangible outputs, and we need those outputs in the spirit of the GIFCT, which is all about collaborating and supporting the tech industry. So we're thinking, right, what's our output going to be? How are we going to make recommendations and suggest guidance that's applicable for the whole of the tech sector in tackling these issues? Next slide, please. So I mentioned our membership and the level of expertise that we have in this group. We're incredibly lucky. Here you can see the organisations that are represented, but just to give you a summary, we've got 4 tech companies represented, 3 governments, and 18 groups from civil society. And they include, but not exclusively, non-government organisations, non-profits, academics, foundations, human rights expertise, as well as members from wider industry who have expertise in positive interventions. And this is very exciting as we go forward. So in terms of our progress to date, much like Dina, we're very proud that we've hosted our first working group meeting on the 15th of July. And prior to that meeting, we asked our members what they wanted our operating guidelines to be, the ways of working, the behaviours they want to see engendered as part of our working group going forward. And I'm really pleased to be able to share with you some of those themes that emerged and that we are now embedding as part of our operating guidelines. They are trust, collaboration, transparency, coming with a global mindset and an open perspective, and a commitment to make the best use of everyone's expertise within the working group. Following the working group, we also circulated a high-level draft plan. And that will be our opportunity to set out our plan for the next 12 months. So the next working group will be in mid-August. And it's at this point that we will invite all of the working group members to also talk through, hopefully, the feedback we've got between now and then and views on the initial working group plan. And as part of that meeting, there are some high-level questions that we're going to have to answer. You've heard me mention the ultimate deliverable. We're going to need to decide what we want the output of this group to be. And it could be outputs. What we think the milestone deliverables are going to be to get us there. How should we be structured? I mentioned about our objective. It really does connect 2 GIFCT priorities in one. But should we be structuring ourselves in a way that mirrors that objective? but we will obviously need to consider the trade-offs of that if we do have subgroups to make sure that we are still all moving in tandem. Also, this point that I made about definitions. What definitions do we think we should be using? And finally, considering what's in scope of this working group. And sometimes it's as important to consider what isn't in scope as much as what is. So that's it for the working group. But really, I just wanted to also leave you with sort of one point that is, and Dina mentioned it, that we recognise there's going to be a lot of crossover between the working groups, or potential crossover. Already from our first working group meeting, it was apparent that we're going to have crossover with the transparency working group. But we could equally have crossover with the research working group if we find gaps in our knowledge base and our understanding as a collective. We could have crossover with legal frameworks, and we could also have crossover with technical approaches when we're thinking about positive interventions. So it's going to be incumbent on all of the co-facilitators and co-leads to make sure that we are all working together, one, to mitigate the risk of duplicating work, but also recognising the opportunities to collaborate and contribute to the GIFCT's mission. Thank you very much for listening to me. I look forward to seeing some of you in the breakout session. And with that, I will hand over to the incredible Jacqueline Boucher.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And at the risk of piling on, I will also welcome Nick and say that I've enjoyed getting to know him over the past month or so, and welcome to his team. And thank you for the collaborative efforts of all of the facilitators and the co-leads on these working groups as we have launched this structure. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to facilitate the Crisis Response Working Group. I have the privilege of leading this group with a number of representatives from the European Union, Yolanda, Antonis, Alberto, Agna, and Ian, all of whom you will meet if you've signed up for our breakout session later today. If this working group has a distinguishing characteristic, I would posit that it is the length of time that this work has been in process. For instance, the first iteration of the GIFCT's Content Incident Protocol, or CIP, was first penned in March of 2019. The drafting of the Christchurch Call's Shared Crisis Response Protocol quickly followed, also the EU Crisis Response Protocol, and others, and there are still others that are being developed. But it is this working group that has brought together all of these efforts for the purpose of collaborating across stakeholder groups to minimize the spread of terrorist or violent extremist content online stemming from a real-world event. If there were another distinguishing characteristic about this group, it would be our focus on analyzing, evaluating, and improving our efforts at a distinct point in time in these protocol processes. That is, upon the initiation of one or more of the crisis response protocols. The next slide lists the strategies articulated in our top-line strategic plan, and they're really quite simple. We want to minimize the spread of violating content while respecting human rights. We want to endeavor to work seamlessly across sectors during a content incident, and we want to maintain a keenly focused eye on continuous improvement. This slide shows the makeup of our membership. In total, some 25 individuals from a variety of stakeholder groups, disciplines, and sectors. We had our first meeting on June the 23rd, where we created our operating guidelines for how we work together, and we reviewed our draft top-line strategic plan. We had a follow-on meeting last week at which the owners of 6 existing or in-process crisis protocols presented those protocols for the full working group. The intent here was to level set and to inventory what exists that we know of, allowing us to expose synergies and identify gaps between and among the various protocols. All of this, of course, is going to help frame our work moving forward. The next slide shows that our working group is focused on developing, testing, and improving all crisis response protocols. We plan to meet roughly every 8 weeks, And in between meetings, other activities will be taking place. For instance, the GIFCT has instituted quarterly SIP playbook reviews. These are taking place amongst industry, and we have our first such review coming up next month. Individual stakeholders are also driving multi-stakeholder tabletop exercises. We saw successful in-person exercises last year, sponsored by the European Union and also sponsored by Google and New Zealand. The EU exercise took place in September of last year, and the Google and New Zealand sponsored event and exercise was held in December. Later this year, both the European Union and Australia are planning separate virtual tabletop exercises. And we want to prioritize multi-stakeholder post-incident debriefs. I think we all debrief within our individual sectors and geographies following an event or following the initiation of our own protocol, but we want to benefit from that wider thinking, again, with that constant eye on continuous improvement. Finally, our working group is interested in learning about and including in our discussions other crisis protocols from other geographies beyond the 6 that we level set on last week, namely the Australia's in-process domestic protocol, the EU crisis response protocol, New Zealand's domestic protocol, the UK national protocol, the Christchurch Call shared crisis response effort, and of course the GIFCT industry. We are certainly open to pointers to and involvement from other geographies. So if you have a protocol that has been created or is in the process of coming together, please feel free to reach out to us. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I will turn it over to Nick Pickles from Twitter, who is leading on legal frameworks.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully, my deck is now showing as well. Can I get a thumbs up if the slides are visible? Great, thank you very much. Well, just to echo previous comments, it's great to be here with you all remotely and to have welcomed Nick, his team, and thank you to Jacqueline and Courtney and the team at Microsoft as well for their stewardship through what's been, I think we can all agree, a pretty unprecedented year of challenges and events. So I'm grateful to be supported in the work leading the Legal Frameworks Working Group by Louis Victor and Joshua Gelser, who represent respectively the French government and the Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, which brings an industry, government and legal perspective to the conversations, which has already added a huge amount of value. So we've been considering, and as you've heard some of the other working groups discuss, it's very important to identify what you're not going to do to ensure that the work that you deliver will be focused. And so we had 2 very clear non-goals as we were establishing this, and we've actually added a third, which I think is very important, which is to highlight that this is not GIFCT's legal advice. This working group isn't giving legal advice to the organisation, and so the outputs of it aren't treated in that way. But the 2 critical decisions we did make, firstly, this wouldn't be a process to discuss the legal frameworks for designation or definitions of organised terrorist organisations. Many of you have been involved in those conversations in different forums, and we felt that this wasn't the right forum to discuss this, and we wanted to focus on more practical, impactful work. Secondly, and I think previous working group leads have mentioned this, to avoid duplicating the work that's happening in the Transparency Working Group, there's going to be good collaboration between the working groups, and the Legal Frameworks Working Group is here to support the other working groups if they have legal questions, but we're not here to answer the questions being investigated by the other groups. So we're looking at the areas of opportunity for improvement, really. How can we all collectively enable more, and I say more whether that means greater transparency to civil society and journalists, greater speed of work between companies during a crisis, or indeed more facilitation of collaboration around the kind of issues that you've heard from Lucy's working group. So we're focused on mapping out the types of data involved, the stakeholders, and the different frameworks, identifying concerns, and that work's already started. And so bringing together different stakeholders has been very powerful there. And then the opportunities to improve. And that's the real focus here is we want to come out with practical, tangible recommendations. So in terms of our strategies for working forward, we've already started working on some of this with members, is identifying the current concerns people have. In our first meeting, the phrase Mythbusters was used, and so we do think we'll be identifying some issues where actually it's more a question of understanding and clarity than about the legal framework itself needing to change. Looking at the types of data being discussed, we've already identified different issues between content data and user data, and then looking at the relevant legal frameworks, whether that's ECPA in the US or GDPR in Europe. Lots of conversations about what relevant frameworks exist. We're going to be looking at how we can improve the opportunities for people to whether it's non-profit and civil society organizations, industry, government, looking at compliance issues and how we can evaluate opportunities to improve. And one thing we do recognize is that a lot of these questions will be ones that regulators might want to look at, that policymakers might want to look at, that civil society and academia will want to look at. And so one of the things we'll be doing is identifying these opportunities for people to provide guidance, clarity to address some of the questions. We'll also, through the co-leads, be engaging with different stakeholders who aren't in the working groups directly, but for whom we do want to hear from. So a quick, again, recognition of the diverse membership we've got in this working group, I think reflected in many others, a mix of government, industry, academia, civil society, but also bringing in kind of expertise like we're deeply grateful to have Claude Moraes, who's a former member of the European Parliament and former chair of the Libe committee there, who worked on GDPR as it was being drafted. So in terms of progress to date, we've had our first meeting and we're working through the final edits to the strategic plan, but that's broadly agreed. And we've already made progress on identifying initial concerns and opportunities. So we're now working on the deliverables and the work plan. And to give you a sense of where we are, we're looking by the end of August to have this first step of the concerns that people may have captured, so that we can begin by the end of September to address the opportunities that may arise and also the mapping of these different frameworks. One of the things that we want to build in time for is that when the preliminary report is finished, is seeking wide feedback from outside the working group as well. As I say, there may be opportunities for different stakeholders to offer opinions that we would want to include, and so we'll be leaving plenty of time for that. So that's a run through. Again, grateful for all the participants, the engagement, my two co-leads for helping make this progress and helping make the group a success. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Erin, who has the enviable task of leading the transparency working group. And so I will hand over to Erin. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. So this is an honor to be here, and technical glitches seem appropriate to enter into the technical approaches working group dialogue. But we just wanted to kind of reiterate that the reason these topics came up was not just out of the blue, but because over the last 3 years, since 2017, we've been holding workshops in collaboration with Tech Against Terrorism all over the world, as well as e-learning sessions with experts. We've come out with academic research papers last year with the Global Research Network on Terrorism Technology, and that work is continuing with the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. And it's because of those insights and those multi-sector meetings that these 6 topics emerged as sort of the cutting edge of what GIFCT wanted to address in more depth going forward, especially with the launch of an independent NGO. And so I have the pleasure of co-leading and facilitating 2 different working groups. Really easy topics like technical approaches to countering terrorism and violent extremism and transparency. And I approach these difficult topics, thankfully, with really competent co-leads. And for the technical approaches working group, that includes Adam Hadley, the director of Tech Against Terrorism, an extremely useful and lucky partnership because Tech Against Terrorism understands both the breadth and the depth of the online space, and in parallel to that, understands the threats that come along with that. Again, not just Islamist extremist terrorism, but also white supremacy and neo-Nazi terrorism, in some parts of the world, Buddhist extremist terrorism, and other forms of violent extremism, such as misogyny-based violence, and otherwise. And so we really want to capture the diversity where if we approach these technical aspects of how to solve, that we understand the diversification of what that looks like. And with me as a co-lead as well is Elizabeth Coulter, the head of engagement with industry and law enforcement for the UK Home Office, which is also really helpful to have that government perspective, especially around how governments also employ technology and tooling approaches when they look at things like terrorism and violent extremism. And so with them as my co-leads, we really talked through objectives of what we wanted from this group. We really want to look at how to evaluate, how to support, and how to assess. And with evaluation, we are looking at, firstly, how far have we come with technology, what technology is at play, but really also what gaps still exist between different companies or in general, and we really want to make sure that technical approaches don't just work for the larger companies that have more finance, more manpower, more engineering support, but also for some of the smaller platforms and even micro platforms. And on the support side, we want to develop and adapt technical solutions in a more disruptive way. We are looking at the proliferation. Everything is now cross-platform and transnational in nature. So how do we support other tech companies to bring on different technical approaches to help them, usually with scale and speed? And then finally, assessment. We really don't want to solve for terrorism at the cost of free speech and human rights. So what are the ethical and human rights concerns associated with each and every type of technical approach that we might be putting forward? And how do we make sure that if someone's going to take on that technology, that they understand the risk mitigations around that? So for some of our strategies for this, we want to look at this technical threat assessment work. We really want to assess and prioritize the current and emerging use and exploitation of the internet by terrorist and violent extremist actors, and make a prioritization of technical needs for each type of tech company around what that might look like, whether that's content detection, crisis response mechanisms, recidivism, different referrals that might be coming in from the online community, or moderation flows, what judges from tooling to human review. We also want to make sure that after 6 months we get a technical gap analysis, really assessing the different challenges that tech companies face in terms of manpower, processes, what they are seeing with data, and what tools are feasible for their platforms, and evaluating that gap and where we might be best placed to fix some of that. And then the deployment of recommendations. So how do we prioritize technical requirements and prerequisites? Feasibility analysis. It's all fine and well to say that you have a piece of technology that's a wonderful solution, but if it increases the manpower needed and a company doesn't have that, what's that going to look like? And then identifying opportunities to increase technical collaborations with GIFCT support. So we will be making recommendations on those strategies. And we really wanted to also ensure that we had a diversity of sector as well as global representation as much as possible. So our working group thankfully does have 7 different technology companies or tooling companies, which represent both very large and very small, almost microsites. And so it's going to be good to get that perspective on what's possible, as well as 7 different academic experts, 6 practitioners that are in the PVE, CVE spectrum or in the intelligence spectrum, as well as human rights practitioners and some government representatives to ensure that we're not just thinking of it in a microscopic lens, just solving for the tech side without the other repercussions. And I've brought together progress to date with next steps and other pertinent info. We have officially had our first meeting, which was wonderful to see everyone on a call. We've just started to strategize next steps, which will include a session on quick fires for tech companies to discuss what tools they already use in practice, how that has an interplay with manpower, and then have some deep dives with the experts to talk about adversarial shifts that they're seeing, what they're seeing in tactics being deployed by violent extremists and terrorists around the world. So this will build into our mapping and gap analysis. And from there, we've jumped to transparency. So I'm also a facilitator for the Transparency Working Group, and I'm very lucky to have Jeremy West as my co-facilitator. He is at the OECD as a senior policy analyst, and some of you on this call might also know him from leading an entire work stream the OECD is doing about transparency, specifically on terrorism and violent extremist content. So we want to recognize that we're not starting from zero in this space. We want to bring on efforts from elsewhere to see this as a compatible parallel work stream and not something separate to it. And with that, we're going to be looking at developing best practices and easy access to resources that facilitate greater transparency. So this is not just for tech companies. If you've noticed the GIFCT website today in the last 24 hours, the second transparency report of GIFCT just went live. And so you can go through there and see some of those numbers. GIFCT, being an NGO, still wants to hold itself to transparency. So if you dive in there, you'll see things like the updated mission statement to ensure it includes violent extremism and not just terrorism. The overall structure that's been updated, the inclusivity of an independent advisory committee, and probably most importantly, of interest is updates on our URL sharing efforts and our hash sharing consortium numbers, which includes post-Christchurch 2 content incident protocols that took place for Halle, Germany, and Glendale, Arizona. So more on that if you join our breakout session. And so we really want to facilitate easy ways to be more transparent, again, while respecting privacy and human rights and understanding those trade-offs. So our strategies for transparency will be about mapping existing multi-sector approaches, again, recognizing that we're not starting from zero, that we should be taking into consideration all the existing efforts that have taken place to date, as well as assessing gaps in transparency, but not just for tech companies. We definitely want to start there, but also see where can NGOs speak to their efforts? Where can governments provide greater baseline transparency as well? Sometimes that helps tech companies get to a better space. And what are the trade-offs of human rights implications in transparency approaches? We also want to be providing resources and guidelines to foster that greater transparency. So it's one thing to tell people to be more transparent, but a lot of assistance, as Adam Hadley will definitely tell you in mentoring some of these tech companies, it's not that easy to put a metric on a piece of paper sometimes. So we want to develop baseline principles to foster that transparency. When we look at membership, I think there was a lot more interest, especially from the human rights community, about this. It's a very important and pertinent topic of how we make sure that we are doing as many efforts as possible to counter terrorism and violent extremism, but that doesn't overstep into censoring journalists, censoring civil rights groups. When you look at how terrorism is defined in other parts of the world, what's the complication with that? So we do have a multi-sector group that includes a handful of human rights practitioners as well as government representatives, but again, a large body of the tech companies and academic experts. And we ensure that we have some representation coming from other parts of the world just to keep us honest and make sure that if we're applying something to a Western standard, what does that look like in Morocco or New Zealand or Israel? And that's going to be an interesting discussion going forward. Again, we've had our first meeting and we've started to strategize these next steps. Once again, we're going to have some quick fire dives into, first and foremost, the GIFCT transparency report, since I think there's a lot of interest in making sure that that gets to a really good space before looking more broadly about how have tech companies approached this, what's easy and hard for a tech company to show in terms of transparency, and getting some of the experts to speak to other methodologies and frameworks that exist. So this will build into our mapping, gap analysis, and resource assessment. Thank you. And with that, I'm really happy to hand this back over to our new executive director, Nick Rasmussen.
Great. Thank you, Erin, and thank you to our other working group chair colleagues as well. I want to quickly introduce a panel of 3 distinguished colleagues who will each provide their own perspective on the various work streams that were described by our working group chairs. First, we have Evelyn Dueck from the Harvard Law School. Evelyn will be followed by Tobias Vipich from the German law enforcement organization, BKA. And finally, we will hear from Dia Kayali from the NGO Witness, which helps people use video and technology to protect and defend human rights. I'm very pleased that each of these three distinguished professionals has joined us for their perspective on the working group agendas that we've heard about in the last few minutes. So first, let me turn over to you, Evelyn. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I'm extremely grateful to you and to everyone today for these presentations and for the opportunity to respond. I want to take a little bit of a broader lens in my response here, and let me be as clear as I can be. I consider what you're doing here to be one of the most important and perhaps under the radar projects for the future of platform governance and indeed the future of free expression online, which quite frankly means free expression full stop, or as the Americans say, period, given that all speech is pretty much online now, especially in quarantine. So that's not only because of the GIFCT itself and its intrinsic importance, although it certainly is intrinsically important, no one can doubt that. But it's also because, and I don't want to stress anyone out, but whatever you do here, for better or for worse, will be a model for what comes next across a range of a variety of content areas. And we know this because we're seeing it happen already. The GIFCT is an example of something that I have in my work called a content cartel, which, as might be apparent, is not fully intended to be a compliment. No one should say I'm not brave coming here today and saying that. So by content cartel, I mean an arrangement between platforms and sometimes governments to work together to remove content or actors from their services without adequate oversight or transparency. And in terms of content cartel creep, as I have called it, we've seen calls for an expansion of this kind of model in a variety of areas. So we're already seeing the success of the GIFCT and of similar collaborations or governance models in the context of child sexual abuse material being invoked to call on platforms and governments to collaborate in more and more other areas, most notably foreign interference, but also misinformation more broadly, particularly in the context of COVID-19 and the infodemic, as it has become known, and then increasingly in the context of an even broader array of content types, like hate speech, harassment, deep fakes. I could go on. I have had off-the-record conversations with platforms and lawmakers, and somebody has even said the words to me, "an everything cartel," in response to my work. And I don't think we're there yet, but that is kind of one of the ideas that's being thrown around. So the premise and promise of these arrangements is that there is information sharing and technology sharing in content moderation more broadly that can be extremely helpful. You can leverage expertise and resources, in particular help smaller platforms, and take a holistic whole of internet approach to solving the problems caused by harmful content, especially as Erin was just mentioning, so many of these issues now are cross-platform issues. It doesn't make sense to view things as an isolated platform, siloed platform by platform problem, when that's not how adversaries or bad actors view these problems. So I strongly believe in the promise of and necessity of collaboration and working together. The concern is that these kinds of arrangements can compound already existing accountability deficits, while also giving decisions a false patina of legitimacy and augmenting the power of the powerful. So in these kinds of arrangements, the source of individual decisions can be harder to identify and hold to account. So for example, who adds a particular piece of content to the database and what kind of standards they're applying. Errors and biases can be magnified beyond individual platforms, while remediation and appeals remain siloed within each individual content moderation ecosystem, making it much harder for users who are affected by wrong decisions to get remedies and due process. And we know that smaller platforms do benefit from these arrangements, but we also know from experience in other areas that they're also often powerless within them and unable to adjust them according to their own requirements, or the powerful platforms generally can run the show, or we have seen that in other intergovernmental and interorganizational arrangements in the past. And these kinds of problems become all the more true as we expand the model to content types that are harder and harder to define. So we see and hear this concern in the context of the GIFCT as it expands to include more and more borderline content and gray area content, as we've heard mentioned a couple of times today. And I know everyone here is aware of these concerns because that's exactly what this project is aimed at mitigating. And that's why I consider this work so incredibly important. I will say, I think you have an uphill battle ahead of you. In my work, I've tried to recognize the very real benefits of platform and government collaborations and the ways in which it might be crucial and unavoidable as a part of the future of content moderation. And I will say I have not been successful at convincing everyone. And in trying to carve out a middle path that sort of tries to take the good and mitigate some of the bad and recognizes both the promises and perils of these arrangements, I've been slammed by both sides. So I hope you're looking forward to that as well. I'm sure you're used to it as much as I am. We're still very much in the early days of working out what proper transparency and oversight looks like and how to facilitate accountability and remediation, protection of minority rights, and how to build trust while acknowledging areas for improvement. And I believe, for example, the second transparency report that Aaron was just mentioning that was released today is a good step, but also illustrates just how far there really is to go to have meaningful disclosure. For a lot of people working in that in this space, that isn't really the kind of details that we're hoping for. To facilitate meaningful conversations and accountability around this. So these are really important open questions, and it's clear from today that you know that there's a lot of work to be done in answering them. And so writing on your work here is not only the future of the online public sphere, but also perhaps more importantly, vindication of my own work in this space. And so I am wishing you absolutely every success. And with that, I'll hand over to Tobias.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Nick, for the introduction and the invitation and the opportunity to serve as respondents to the working group presentations. It is a real honor for us. And I also would like to thank Jacqueline from Microsoft for organizing and chairing the crisis response working group. You're doing a great job and we really appreciate the work done so far. Yeah, I'm on? Okay, I can't see anything, I'm sorry. So in the next few minutes, I would like to concentrate on subject crisis response and provide our professional, our operational perspective as a law enforcement agency. Terrorist attacks as happened in Christchurch, Halle and Glendale have shown that the collaboration between the internet industry, governments and first responders is very important and to be able to react to those incidents on all levels as fast as possible to minimize the spread of terrorist or violent extremist content stemming from a real-world event. In this context, various protocols have been established since then, which were presented in the second virtual meeting of the Crisis Response Working Group. From our point of view as a law enforcement agency, it was really interesting to get to know these protocols, to see the basic similarities, but also to see the differences between them. The Christchurch Call, for example, outlines collective voluntary commitments from governments and online service providers. The communication guidelines focus mainly on the online service providers to take transparent, specific measures to prevent the upload of violent extremist content online and its dissemination, including its immediate and permanent removal. Furthermore, we learned that Australia, New Zealand, and the UK have domestic protocols that work more on an operational level, defining measures taken by governments and authorities. The EU crisis protocol is quite similar. It is merely a cross-border protocol that puts all EU member states under one roof. The GIFCT in comparison is an international association of globally acting online service providers. The content incident protocol is a playbook that basically contains measurements independently taken by the tech companies organized in the GIFCT in case of a real-world event. However, in the course of the presentation of the various protocols from our operational point of view, we have identified a few important gaps we wish to close within the crisis response working group. These are as follows. The first point are the differences between the protocols. As I've already described, there are quite a lot of differences between the protocols, not only regarding the addresses and the measurements, but also concerning the thresholds for activating them. New Zealand, on the one hand, has a quite low threshold and activates its protocol by any significantly harmful content. It even triggered its own protocol in the Halle attack, although it had no direct impact on New Zealand or its civil society. The GIFCT, on the other hand, has placed very high requirements to trigger the content incident protocol. Therefore, since its existence, the GIFCT has investigated 85 cases, but triggered the content incident protocol only twice, in Halle and Glendale. As a result, this indicates that the harmonization and interoperability of these existing protocols should be pursued in order to establish a coordinated communication and alarm system and to close the gaps between the domestic protocols, including the EU crisis protocol and the content incident protocol. The second point is the inclusion of smaller and regional online service providers, non-GIFCT partners and stakeholders. They need to be included either into the domestic protocols or the GIFCT to improve the cooperation, especially in an event of an attack, to let them participate in the hash sharing database of the GIFCT or the EU IRU. The third point is the cooperation of online service providers if the content incident protocol is not triggered. We also see the need that the GIFCT takes action in cases that do not trigger the content incident protocol but almost reach the threshold. This means if terrorist or violent extremist content is disseminated to a real-world event, we need a close cooperation to react and delete this content as fast as possible to minimize the harm. Point 4, very important, the preservation of data. Additionally, we as a law enforcement agency see a need for preservation of data for investigative purposes. This applies in particular to the live streams, the original data that were put first, that were uploaded first, and the subscriber data of the users behind. Even a technical solution should be considered to ensure that in the future live streams are sent to the competent authorities while they are no longer accessible to the public. And my last point, number 5, immediate release of user and geodata. In the event of an ongoing attack and even in the event of an announced and imminent attack, there's a high need of an immediate release of user and geodata by the online service providers regarding the accounts that are used in particular for the live stream or the publication of the announcement in order to enable the authorities to identify and localize the perpetrator for a fast intervention comparable to an emergency request. All in all, and besides the points of desirable improvement mentioned before, I think that the GIFCT, respectively the online service providers organized within, do an excellent job and have already done so far. This has already been demonstrated by the rapid reaction in the cases of Halle and Glendale. And now, if possible, we need to sharpen and speed up the processes so that we can all respond even better and more professionally to such attacks in the future. Thanks for your attention, and now I would like to hand over to Dia.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. I'm really glad to be here today, and thanks to all the speakers that have already shared their perspectives. First, I want to say, in particular, Evelyn, thank you so much. A lot of what I'm going to say is relevant to and sort of piggybacking on what you've said. So first, I want to say, this new structure of GIFCT and the place that it is taking in all of this work, it is new, and a lot of us are watching us with interest. And I think that it does have a potential for good, but there also is a real potential for negative human rights impact. And so, that has to be really fundamental in the work of the working groups you're doing, and in the work of the Independent Advisory Committee, and in just the work of GIFCT going forward. Now, one thing I want to say, I am a member of some of the working groups. I'm also one of the co-chairs for the advisory network to the Christchurch call. And I do want to center this conversation in that. Much of the renewed vigor in GIFCT and actually in this work in general does stem from the March 2019 Christchurch attack, when a white supremacist murdered 51 Muslims in New Zealand. And that's something that does have to be central in this work, is thinking about what the very real impacts are. And so there are human rights at stake, and freedom of expression is one of those, but the right to life is also one of those. And that is something that, certainly the civil society that's engaged in this is balancing. Now, all of that being said, one of the things that has sort of been implied but we haven't really delved into is there is a fundamental issue in all of this work, and that is the lack of a common definition for terrorism or violent extremism. Lists are political. They are disproportionately focused on terrorism originating in or relating to the Arab and Muslim world. And that is, again, particularly concerning when we think about the kinds of threats that we're seeing today. Now, speaking of threats, and when I say this work and this field, something that is happening is we're seeing content moderation itself be viewed as one of the primary tools for counterterrorism. And it is important that the boundaries are clear. Content moderation has its own issues, and so does counterterrorism. The field of counterterrorism has been implicated in human rights abuses. My work now focuses on human rights content and human rights documentation, but I've also personally done community organizing around surveillance in Arab, Muslim, and Middle Eastern communities in the US. And so we have seen how counterterrorism can lead to overreach. So that's something that really needs to be, again, considered, especially as governments are joining this conversation and are engaging in conversation with civil society. Something also to keep in mind in terms of government participation is there is a potential for government pressure to lead to extra-legal censorship through global internet forums counterterrorism processes. And there is also, to a certain extent, a lack of level playing field for civil society. We've already seen that even in some of the processes that were created before the reorganization of the GIFCT, civil society isn't necessarily there at every step of the way. And so what we really need to see is genuine multi-stakeholder engagement with sustained and responsive engagement. And that is something that I think is possible. One other just negative potential concern that I want to point out, and then I want to go to some of the positives, is that increased use of new technologies without sufficient understanding of impact, in particular those human rights impacts, especially when we are seeing events like Christchurch. This can lead to increased use of machine learning and actually impacts on human rights content. So that's a big intervention that Witness has already been engaging in with this work. Is we're seeing human rights documentation get deleted at an astounding rate, and it is documentation that's coming from the same area where we see a hyper focus on terrorism coming from the Arab and Muslim world. So all of that being said, there are a lot of concerns, I think, about potential increased information sharing and sort of these extra legal processes. Just quickly, I do want to just mention some of the positives. I think there is a possibility for human rights to be baked into new processes as they're being created, and particularly in these working groups. The working groups can create floors for human rights, or can create floors for human rights that say this is the minimum that you have to engage in order to get access to this information or to engage with the GIFCT. So I think that that's something that human rights can bring. Also, it is, as Nick spoke to in the first session this morning, this level of multi-stakeholder engagement, it provides new avenues for communication, and it doesn't have to be one way. So again, as new processes are created, as new research is happening, civil society, in particular with a human rights background, have to be involved and from the ground up. So the last comments I'll make, just as the working groups move forward, it's also important to ensure working groups transparency as well. So not just from the transparency working group, but the work of the working group has to be available to the public, and there has to be engagement around that. So, I do want to second what Evelyn said, that what is happening here, it is a big deal, and it does have a real potential to impact human rights positively or negatively. And I think, if we can see that genuine engagement and real responsive engagement to these human rights concerns, I think there is a glimmer of hope in this new structure. Thanks. And with that, I will pass it back on to Nick.
Thank you, Dia, and actually thank you to Dia, to Evelyn, to Toby for some incredibly thoughtful comments. I think we all came out of the working group presentations knowing that there's some challenging issues to be tackled there, but also an incredibly diverse array of stakeholders who need to be part of that conversation. And I think that was just a really timely reminder of why the GIFCT environment is the way it is, the multi-stakeholder nature of it. And again, we look forward to seeing concrete results emerge from this working group process. I'm sure everybody's aware that the next and final phase of the forum event is going to be carried out in virtual breakout rooms with each of the 6 working groups. And let me just talk through a little bit about how that's going to work and give you some instructions on how access to those breakout rooms is happening. Now, over 100 of you responded to the pre-forum survey that we distributed and shared with us a preference in advance on which room to join. And if you had indicated a breakout preference in that survey, just log on to Zoom yourself before clicking Join Breakout Sessions, and that way you'll be automatically placed in your pre-assigned Zoom room. The system will recognize you using your first and last name, so please make sure those are listed correctly as you register. Now, anyone who wants to participate who did not indicate a breakout preference, as well as anyone who just doesn't want to log into Zoom, is still welcome. It just means that they'll be randomly assigned to a session when you click on Join Breakout Sessions. But before we move into that breakout phase, I just want to say a few words of wrap up quickly, because we decided when thinking about the conference that it wasn't practical for us to do breakouts and then try to reconvene everybody after the breakout room. So I just want to say just a quick few words of wrap up. The only thing I can really say is thank you for your interest in GIFCT and our work. And I can tell that your attendance at an event under these conditions demonstrates everything. It demonstrates that you care deeply about the mission of preventing terrorists and violent extremists from exploiting digital platforms while also respecting and promoting human rights. And that's something we all have a stake in, and your presence here today speaks volumes about your commitment to that. Most of you know I'm only 4 weeks into the role of Executive Director of GIFCT. I can honestly say that those 4 weeks have been exciting and exhilarating, and that's true even though I really never left my basement home office to do this job so far. So I'm very excited to actually get out and spend more time meeting and talking and engaging with you on this call and even a wider universe of stakeholders. And I hope we've taken an advantage of this initial opportunity to engage with you in this forum. But I know there's much more we can do to expand the level of engagement. And so we will look for more opportunities to talk with each other, to each other. And for me personally, to be able to listen and learn from more of you. In the days ahead, we'll reach out to you, but please do share with us your candid feedback on both the event, but also the GIFCT agenda going forward that's been discussed today. And we certainly need and want that feedback. So with that, let me close the more formal plenary part of the Multi-Stakeholder Forum and wish you very well as you depart, whether that's to join a breakout group or to pursue other business. And lastly, thank you again for your patience in dealing with our technical glitches a few minutes ago. The head count that we're able to monitor for participants suggests to us that literally every one of you stuck with us, and so I'm deeply grateful for that. So with that, I wish you well, and I hope to see you in one of the breakout groups. Thank you very much for joining us for this event.